Hi, everyone. Today we're going to explore the ways that, as we look at the way a system functions, outside influence can be quantified, can be understood, and can be accounted for. So, stochasticity refers to things that are not explicitly modeled, things that might well be already determined or might be able to be predicted with another model, but maybe aren't part of our model. So if we're looking at populations, we may not have or be able to build a weather model that then predicts the way that weather is going to affect the populations there. So before we jump into stochasticity too much, I want to remind you about a couple of basic ideas around population modeling. So here's a typical population model graph. We're looking at time, and in this case, we're looking at the population size over time. So the population size is on the y-axis. And if we encounter that population when there are relatively few individuals relative to the total population space, relative to the carrying capacity, how many individuals can fit in that ecological space, whatever it is, that population is likely to grow exponentially. Eventually, if that population gets lucky enough, it will fill all the available ecological spaces, and there will start to be some negative feedback that slows down the population growth. And if the population grows long enough, we expect it to fill all the available ecological space, indicated by the dotted line, which is carrying capacity. And to be clear, populations can exceed carrying capacity and shrink. Um, there are some populations that grow rapidly that never reach carrying capacity because they encounter stochastic events that push the population size back down or eliminate it entirely. Another thing that I want to be clear on is that the shape of this graph matters very much when we first encounter it. So our n sub 0 when we first start looking at this population might be when the population is small, there's plenty of space for it to grow, and many more individuals can be added to it. We might encounter the population when it's already been growing for a while, and so we might see a graph more like this as it approaches carrying capacity. Or we might even encounter the population when it's reached carrying capacity. And so we might see something more like that. All right, since we're talking about carrying capacity is usually thought of as a parameter, a single number. This is how many organisms fit in this environment in this context. But you can imagine that weather might have some strong influence on that. For example, maybe we're following a population of small mammals, and those mammals live in a place that has a great year. Plenty of rain, but not too much. The grass grows well, they have plenty to eat, and we have a high population size. We can actually get more individuals into that habitat because there's more for them to eat. On the other hand, we can imagine a really bad year where they don't have enough to eat and many of them are likely to starve much sooner at much lower population sizes than what we would see in a good year. And so carrying capacity is functionally not a point on a graph, but is a range of values. Some years we can fit lots of individuals, some years we can't fit as many. So, to remind you a little bit about population growth, for one, I love the quote that all models are wrong, some models are useful. And that's true in population models as in any other kind. We know that what actually happens over time rarely matches what was modeled. The question is, does the model capture enough of the dynamics to tell us something useful, novel, or interesting? And logistic growth is this tendency for that model to curve down and to slow its growth as it approaches carrying capacity. And that's an important thing for us to realize. So if we're assuming that a population is going to slow down and it is going to grow less as it approaches carrying capacity, one of the things that we often assume in these models is that the parameters are constant, at least for a given density. So we might be able to predict the birth rates or the death rates for a particular given density. Or maybe we can just even generalize it more and say that the intrinsic growth rate is constant for a given density, or the carrying capacity is constant for a given habitat. That rarely happens in nature. And that's what we're talking about today, is what to do with that variation. We know that birth rates and death rates vary over time. They vary even at the same densities. So we can also expect carrying capacity to fluctuate over time. Those are all things that we might want to incorporate into a demographic model. Those are all things that we might characterize as stochasticity or as stochastic. When the population size is large, we rarely are concerned about it going extinct from stochastic events. Usually those stochastic events are small enough relative to the population size, if it's large, that the population won't be wiped out entirely. On the other hand, stochastic events can often be of sufficient magnitude to push small and at-risk populations out entirely, and to cause them, populations of those organisms, to go extinct. We can break down stochasticity into a couple of different types in population models. So we can break that down into environmental stochasticity, which essentially captures changes in the average birth rates, death rates, or other vital rates as a result of environmental conditions. Demographic stochasticity is the idea that individual fates are not the same as the average rates that they might produce, and that has important consequences for populations. So environmental stochasticity is trying to capture unpredictable changes in the environment, and we know that environmental variation that produces population fluctuations is more likely to cause problems when the population is small, and in fact to cause extinction of that population or that species if the population is small. We already saw an example of environmental stochasticity and how we might incorporate that into a logistic model when we looked at carrying capacity. So that carrying capacity example that I gave earlier is one example of environmental stochasticity and one of the ways that we might capture environmental stochasticity. Environmental stochasticity also includes things like natural catastrophes, things like floods, fires, windstorms, disease outbreaks, pest outbreaks, and that can eliminate or at least greatly reduce populations. On a species level, we might be more in danger of losing an entire species if there's only one population. It only takes one flood to knock down that entire grove of trees that's in a floodplain. Or it only takes one drought to dry up that desert spring that contains an endangered fish. If there are multiple populations for that species, then they've got a chance to avoid some of those localized natural catastrophes. Demographic stochasticity is the idea that chance events related to the survival and reproduction of individuals mean that the fate of individuals is not necessarily the same as an average rate. So if we think about how that might play out, if we were comparing populations, on average those populations might lose 20% of individuals to emigration in a given year. But there are some Some of those populations have individuals that, for no reason that we can model effectively, lose 10%, and other populations lose 30%. And on average, when we look at those populations, we see that we're losing 20% of individuals, but some of those individuals leave maybe because they have a genotype that makes them more prone to dispersal. And other populations have fewer individuals that have that genotype, and so they have more that stay put. Those are some of the ways that demographic stochasticity might play out in a population context. Another way that we could look at that is if we looked at vital rates against the population size. Right? So we might expect the birth rate to be fairly high at small population sizes. There's plenty of environmental, ecological room for them. And then as the population grows, that birth rate declines. The opposite might be true for death rates, right? It might be fairly low at small population sizes, and then it might increase as disease transmission increases or as food becomes more scarce. The difference between those two rates is the growth rate. Where they cross can be thought of as the carrying capacity, and when they rise above the carrying capacity, that becomes negative. So the growth rate becomes negative and the population shrinks. It's also important to note that these can be regions. So the birth rate at a small population size might vary. And that might be due to demographic stochasticity, because individuals simply weren't successful in that year at finding mates. Death rates might be lower than average, because in that year, those individuals had something happen. So you might have had more individuals that got eaten by predators that wandered through. And so you might have this whole range of birth rates and death rates at any given population size. When we look at the applications of stochasticity, one of the classic ones is to think about populations that might be endangered. So in a model by Genevrier from 2014, they looked at emperor penguins and looked at some of the variation that might affect the survival of those birds. And they looked at the global number of breeding pairs, right? And so that's on the y-axis here, the years on the x-axis, and they pulled into their model a whole variety of stochasticities, including environmental stochasticity, to try to predict the range of potential numbers of breeding pairs several decades into the future. And that's what the gray area represents. In other cases, we might want to understand the dynamics of a pest species. So the same types of modeling have been applied to things like gypsy moths. And what we see in some of those populations is that there's substantial differences in terms of the overall population density and rate of spread as a result of stochasticity in the predictive models. And if you think that these types of applications are the extent of how we can use population modeling like this, then you might consider something like cancer. And one of the ideas in cancer biology that has pulled in ecological ideas is that populations of cancer cells might rely on one another to actually get a tumor going and to cause the larger macro problems that we worry about with cancer. And so the authors of this study write that it's quite intuitive that cancer cell growth may exhibit cooperative interactions analogous to the cooperation among species in an ecosystem, and we might extend that to among individuals in an ecosystem. It's also true that the fate of those cancer cells is likely to have some individual variability. And so there's some stochasticity in the system, as well as the application for a population model here. And so the authors tried to understand tumor growth kinetics at low cell numbers because this is of some clinical importance. That process governs the way that tumor initiation begins. It also governs the way that we respond to those tumors and how likely those tumors are to recur. In this study, they also identified an Ali effect. They identified that these small populations actually grow more slowly than we would predict based on a model like this. And so, as a result, they also saw some cooperation amongst these cells that's probably important to understanding the way that cancers develop. So I hope that this was an interesting take on the way that we understand variation around and within populations. And you can keep going and see how to incorporate this variation into spreadsheet models. Thanks for listening.